Hi, I'm Ellen with artsyprettyplants.com, and today I'm going to show you how to make a concrete cowboy boot planter that's cast from a mold that we're going to make. I was at Hobby Lobby and I found this cowboy boot and fell in love with it because I actually wore cowboy boots to my wedding, and this looks so much like the cowboy boots, and I've always wanted to figure out how I could turn this into a concrete planter. But as you can see, it's going to have lots of undercuts. It's an odd shape. It's not something that's going to demold easily. So I knew I wasn't going to be able to use a regular silicone mold for this. And I wasn't sure what kind of material would actually work for this. Plus, it needed to be something that was going to pick up fine detail if it was going to look the way I wanted it to look. So I thought I might know what the material was, and I finally went ahead and tried it, and it worked. So one thing that I have to warn you about is that you're going to have to remove the spur off of this because it's going to be completely impossible to demold otherwise. I completely spaced out and forgot to remove it until it was too late, and I was already too far into it to remove it. So I had to go through a lot of trouble to mend it and take care of it, and I don't recommend doing it that way. Go ahead and break it off from the beginning. I know it's a bummer. These are pretty inexpensive. You can get two of them and keep the other one, on your shelf. But I actually had one that had accidentally, the spur had broken off. That's the one I should have used for the mold, and I wouldn't have had to go through all that anyway. So initially for this tutorial, I didn't paint the concrete planter, but I went ahead and did it later. You'll actually, if you want to know how I did that, go to my website. I've got the link in the description below. I have the full written tutorial there. It's got lots of details in it, and you'll see how I painted it, and you also get the full materials listed there. So I'll show you how to make the mold for this and also how to cast the planter. Let's get started. Take a piece of clay and press it onto a tile or any flat, smooth surface. Then press a cowboy boot down into the clay. The clay should be about 1/4 inch thick and will be used to keep the boot in place while you're working on it. I recommend making the clay nice and flat. As you can see, mine was lumpy and uneven, which made my mold not be straight. The boot only needs to be pressed in far enough that it doesn't fall out when tipped upside down. Take the mold builder and brush it onto the boot. Very light coats are important when doing this, especially for the first 2 layers. We're going to be brushing on about 12 layers altogether. Remember, keep this layer and the next layer very thin. These first 2 layers have the potential of getting holes in the mold material or even bubbles, which is why we need to keep it thin. And this can also happen if you brush over spots you have just recently brushed, so try to avoid double brushing. If you do end up with holes, just leave it alone because you'll be able to cover it during the next layer. If you get a bubble, pop it, and then after you've dried it, you'll fix it by brushing over it when doing the next layer. You'll also need to brush the liquid latex onto the clay. This will create a flange which will be needed when you're casting the concrete. Brush it about 1/4 inch past the clay and onto the tile as well. The top of the boot has a lip inside of it where you'll see the yellow. You'll be able to feel where it stops. Don't brush the mold builder past this point. Use a heat gun to speed up the drying time. It took several minutes to get each layer to dry, but would have been much longer without it. You can try using a hairdryer if you don't have a heat gun. Just make sure you keep moving it back and forth. You don't want to get one spot too hot. Also, you'll want to keep track of how many layers you're putting on. The best way to do this is to write down on a piece of paper one hatch mark for every layer. Now brush on the second layer, again in a thin coat. After this, you'll move on to making the insert. For this insert, cut a piece of acetate to 3 1/8 by 3 inches wide and roll it into an oval shape. So the 3 1/8 will be your height, and the oval should be no more than 1/2 inch wide. I'm actually using a shelf liner, but acetate will work great and cost less. Insert this inside the boot to check that it fits correctly. Keep in mind the insert will be much thicker before you finish, so you'll need a decent bit of wiggle room. You're probably noticing in the video I'm doing this step after my 8th layer of brushing the mold builder onto the boot, as you can tell by the hatch marks. It's just because I hadn't decided yet how I wanted to make the insert. To save yourself some time, you should definitely make the insert after the second layer of mold builder goes onto the boot. That way you can keep alternating the building of each layer between this and the boot. Now, if the size is good, just tape it together with packing tape. Now you'll need to fill the void. Do this with some gauze. Just cut a small piece and stuff it into the end of the insert. Next, you'll basically glue it in there by brushing on the mold builder. I used a marker to hold the gauze in place while I brushed the latex rubber onto it. For some reason, I'm using a piece of foam instead of a tile. I should have just did what I did with the boot and used the 1/4 inch of clay and the tile. With the foam, I couldn't tell my insert was straight, and so this caused me problems with the molds not lining up. For this, just add the 2 layers that are thin and then alternate brushing on layers between the boot and this until you have 9 layers on each. Your insert will be sitting on a piece of flat clay on a tile. Just remember the latex gets brushed over the clay and onto the tile to create the flange. Here's where you're applying the next 7 layers for these. Keep in mind these layers can be applied thicker. Once the 9 layers have dried, we're going to apply gauze material, which will reinforce the molds, making them stronger. Now that we have 9 layers on both, start with the boot and cut several pieces of gauze that are the lengths of the boot. Also, cut 2 small pieces which we'll use to fill in the voids at the arch of the foot and under the toe. Use something pointy like a pen to help push the gauze into the voids. Now brush the mold builder onto the areas where the gauze is. Next, brush the mold material onto the boot and fully cover it. Then place the strips of gauze on the boot and be sure the gauze is also covering it fully. You only need the gauze to stick well enough that it stays in place for now. Be sure to lay the gauze inside the top edge of the boot and also the flange. Make sure to trim any excess gauze pieces. Once you have the boot covered, then you can apply the liquid latex to the gauze. You'll probably need to scoop the mold material up with your brush to get enough of the mold material on, because the gauze just sort of sucks up all the moisture from it, so you really kind of need to goop it on there. Cover the gauze fully and then dry it. This layer will take longer than the others to dry. Now for the final 2 layers to cover the gauze fully and the mold to finally be done. I finally got smart and decided I would be better off applying the gauze layers to this if I had it on a tile. Just repeat making the gauze layer for the insert the same as you did for the boot, and then apply 2 more layers after that and the insert mold will be done. Now that all the layers have been applied and dried, it's time to check to make sure the insert still fits the boot mold. Go ahead and peel the latex rubber mold material off of the acetate insert and insert this into the boot. Like I mentioned, I had a little trouble with mine not fitting properly because both my molds were not standing straight because of the way they were sitting in their bases. It didn't end up causing any major trouble, but it was kind of a pain because I had to keep making sure everything was straight when casting the concrete. There's going to be one direction that this insert fits the boot better than the other. Once you figure this out, be sure to label this direction onto each mold. Use a permanent marker to write heel on the insert flange on whichever side that it's touching the heel. Then write toe on the flange where it touches the toe. You should write these on both the inside and outsides of the flange to help you see them better when casting the cement, since it might get messy and obscure your labels. Additionally, mark these same labels on the top shaft end of the boot as well. Here's where we'll create the drainage hole. I considered having this be part of the insert and building mold material around it, but you would have to leave the straw in place to give it enough rigidity. Instead, adding a hole to add the straw after the fact gives you some flexibility if you ever want to make one without a drainage hole for an air plant or any other application. The rubber is surprisingly strong, and I did have a little trouble getting the X-Acto knife through it to make the hole and insert the straw, but it was actually the gauze inside that fought with me the most. I found the trick of getting the straw inserted was to use the non-brush end of the paintbrush and then pushing that through the inside of the insert. Then I could thread the straw onto that and pull it through. Here's how everything looks with everything inserted in place. And now for casting the boot. Glue the top of the straw. This is just so that cement doesn't accidentally get inside. I didn't record this, but I did use mineral oil to lubricate the insert, straw, and the boot mold. The reason I use mineral oil instead of vegetable oil is because vegetable oil tends to leave yellow stains on the cement. Since mineral oil doesn't come as a spray, I just poured a little inside the boot and rolled it around. Then I used a cotton ball to spread it, and I also used a cotton ball to spread it around the insert mold. Additionally, I strongly recommend lubricating the outside of these molds as well. Mix the cement to a consistency of a thick brownie batter. Mix the cement to a consistency of a thick brownie batter. You'll see here that I didn't place the insert inside before casting this. I was concerned the cement wouldn't get into all the voids, mainly because I had made the mistakes early on that caused my insert to be crooked. I figured out in subsequent castings that it worked just fine to cast this with the insert in place. It was much less messy. I just had to pull it out slightly and give it a shake, and then press it back in to properly fill the voids. You shouldn't need to do this. Be sure to vibrate this as best you can. I tapped it on the tile, then also used my fingers to help with the vibrating. This piece takes a little longer than normal to cure. I would check it at about 1.5 hours instead of the regular 1 hour. And because of the crooked insert, I needed to support the toe area so it wouldn't tilt when curing. Demolding this was never super easy. The cement always wants to stick. Just start from the bottom toe area and work toward the heel. Then keep peeling it back up the shaft. If you're using the cement all I listed in the materials, then you should be able to apply pressure while demolding, and you shouldn't need to worry about it cracking, as long as it has fully cured. I needed to use pliers to chip back where cement had overflowed on the outside of the mold because it was preventing the mold from coming off. When I made the recording, I hadn't applied the oil to the outside of the molds, which is why I recommended that you do in case you do get cement anywhere on the outside of the mold. The white oval piece you see there is a homemade cement sanding block. I highly recommend making one of these from leftover cement. It works great as a fantastic low grit sanding block. I used it to sand this, but I also used my 60 grit diamond sanding sponge, which was quite a bit quicker at taking down the rough edges. For tips on painting it, go to my website artsyprettyplants.com. I've got some details there.